Hello, welcome everyone. I'm a program attorney with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and welcome to today's webinar. It's part of our summer webinar series on issues around the intersection of child protection and domestic violence. Today's program will introduce a new safety card for child welfare workers to use with mothers experiencing domestic violence. It will include practice strategies for child welfare workers on how to partner and educate mothers and female caregivers about the impact of childhood trauma and domestic violence on themselves and parenting. The presenter will also discuss strategies for collaboration between domestic violence programs and child welfare agencies. Our presenters today are Shelley Taggart. She has been working in the intersection of domestic violence and child welfare for 18 years as a practitioner, a coach and trainer, and as a consultant, and is the author of many practice guides and training curricula in use in the field. She has worked with both the National Council and Futures Without Violence for many years. We also have Liana Kinnicott, who is a program director at Futures Without Violence and has over 10 years of experience in the domestic violence field. She is the lead TA provider on the DHHS Expanding Services for Children and Youth Experiencing Domestic Violence program. And with that, I will turn it over to Liana and Shelley. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I want to also thank Amanda, Alicia, Amber, Patricia, and Aaron, and all of the rest of the team at NCJ-FCJ for your partnership on this webinar series and for all of the wonderful technical support. Again, my name is Liana Kinnicott. I work in the Children and Youth Department here at Futures. I'm so thrilled to be here to kick us off for this new tool that we are sort of soft launching today. I wanted to say a few words about Promising Futures before I hand it over to Shelley. As Amanda said, this is a project funded by the Department of Health and Human Services Family and Youth Services Bureau under the Expanding Services for Children and Youth project. I'd also like to thank HHS and specifically Mary Louise Kelly, Shondell Dawson, and Mao Yang for their leadership on this issue and commitment to providing resources to support children and youth. Futures is the lead TA provider for this project, and our goal is to really support state DV coalition, domestic violence and sexual assault coalitions, local DV programs, and community partners in enhancing their responses to children, youth, and their parents who are experiencing domestic violence. The new safety card that Shelley will talk about later was developed under this project. Let's see. Show you we also have a robust online clearinghouse of materials at promisingfutureswithoutviolence.org. The URL is on your screen that I encourage you all to check out. It has a database of clinical interventions for children who've experienced DV and other traumas. It includes capacity building resources, numerous tools, fact sheets, posters, training materials, brochures, and a whole lot of other free resources for download. I would also encourage you to reach out to me with TA questions and to share all the wonderful work you are doing in your community. We have a section on the website where we profile organizations, states, and folks doing amazing work. So please let me know what you're up to in your community. There's a share your link or share your work link on the website on pretty much every page on the right-hand side. So please get in touch with me. Our sort of team email is up on the screen now, but we will also provide our my specific contact information at the end. And once again, check out promisingfutureswithoutviolence.org. And without much further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Shelley.
Thanks so much, Liana, and all of you there at the Council. Welcome to everyone who's joining us today. I was happy to see that we had such a large list of people who are interested in this topic, and I'm sure that the energy and enthusiasm for the work has been building over the course of the webinar series. So I'm excited to be part of this effort. This webinar today is primarily about introducing you to the We Believe Moms Matter card and how we think it can be used to enhance a child welfare response. It's designed as sort of a brief intervention. It's a universal education card. It's one of a series of cards that Futures has produced for use in various settings. For example, there's one for a healthcare setting and so forth, but today's webinar is really focused on the child welfare context. So we're going to be talking a fair amount about, that context and the introduction of this card within that this particular system. Context is everything. We also are going to be talking a little bit later in the webinar about the absolutely critical role of domestic violence partners in this, and I was really excited when I reviewed the participant list to see how many DV folks are on the phone. I hope that means that you're all involved in very robust collaborations with your child welfare agencies in your areas. I just want to, again, sort of emphasize the importance of these collaborations. None of us can do this alone. We have to get better and better at working together. So I'm really happy, again, at the participation level from our DV community. So let me just say a couple more things before I move on from this slide. The framing of this card, we believe moms matter, doesn't, of course, mean that we don't believe that dads matter or that we don't believe that kids matter. They all matter, as do extended family, as does community, right? It only means that we think that the specific needs and experiences and roles of moms are worth paying focused attention to, right? We, both Futures and the Council, have done a tremendous amount of work over the years at building our capacity and sharing lessons from around the country about with men, how to work with kids and so forth. We're having some technology things here. I'll just keep talking. So again, it's really not about excluding anyone. It's about making sure that we're paying focused attention where we need to. And this is sort of one of, as I said, a number of elements of this work. We know that men and women are hurt by intimate partners in gay and lesbian relationships. We know that trans folks are hurt in relationships. We know that women can batter a male partner. And we also know that women are disproportionately impacted by intimate partner violence. So for today, we are focusing on women who are mothers, and we're specifically focusing on moms who are involved in child welfare. You should know, however, that Futures is working on producing a gender-neutral version of this card. So we are working hard to make sure that we're not excluding anyone else who is a parent who might be involved with the child welfare system. Futures is also working on producing a Spanish language version of the card. And unless this has changed since Leanna and I spoke, I think we're probably looking at the end of September or maybe October for that version of the card to be available, the Spanish language version. So I think we're good to go again. I don't know if anybody else saw that little technology glitch there, but it looks like we're back on track. So let's talk a little bit about the context of child welfare. So, if you asked 10 or 20 or 50 people who work within child welfare in any part of the system, what are the goals of child welfare? A lot of people would use language of we keep children safe. And, on some level, it's certainly a true statement. It's the most fundamental level of child protection work, I think, and it's certainly what the public understands our work to be about. And we know that children need more than physical safety, right? Their healthy development requires that we think broadly and that we consider their social needs and their academic needs and their emotional needs and their developmental needs, right? And that we really work to help families learn to address all of those needs in order for children and youth to thrive. So I actually prefer the language in the second bullet on this slide. You may see it similarly. Maybe you see it a little bit differently, but I like the language in the second bullet because to me it sort of incorporates two important ideas that I think are important for child protection. One is that our role is really about facilitating change within families. So really trying to help families get healthier and get better at parenting and so forth. I think I like that language because it sort of takes away the burden of us feeling as though we sort of need to be experts on all family dysfunction and how to fix it, which I think is a pretty common phenomenon in the child welfare agencies that I've worked with. So I like the language of being facilitators of change, and I also like the second idea, which is about building capacities, and I know a lot of child welfare agencies are talking this language now. Building capacities is really about finding where capacity already exists and then finding ways to enhance or deepen or promote more of that so that we can see it consistently in parenting behaviors, right? So, while I said to you that our primary focus today is about introducing you to this card, I am going to be talking for the first 25 minutes or so about context and the value of what I see that this adds to a child welfare context. So bear with me. We're going to get to the card, but I just wanted to give you a little flag on that we're not jumping into the card because it's important to think about our context. With any kind of new intervention strategy or any new tool that we're trying to integrate into our practice, our ability to implement it with fidelity and to sustain its use requires us to really think about where we're trying to apply it, right? So we are a system, this is not going to be news to anybody who works in child welfare, that experiences a fair amount of vicarious trauma. So in some agencies, we talk about this differently. You hear terms like compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress and all of those. But the general idea is that we are a system that is where our people, our staff, are constantly exposed to other people's traumatic stories. And it has an effect on us. And in fact, it has some very specific effects. It can leave us feeling sort of ineffective and hopeless. It can lead us to sort of this chronic suspicion or judgment of others. These are not indictments of our system. These are the realities of working with survivors of a lot of trauma. So, the work has an effect on us as much as we have an effect on the work. So for anybody who hasn't experienced some of these things yourself, I'm sure that you've seen it in coworkers. The point that I want to make about this is that it's important that if we are to do our absolute best work with families, that we find ways to address our own system and the trauma that's created from working sort of within the system. So we have to pay attention to these effects when we see them, to avoid glossing them over, and to recognize and take action when it's time to do something more to return us, whether it's us personally or our organizations, to a state where we can be effective in our work. And to that end, at the end of the presentation, you're going to see a slide with some really great resources on it that you could access to build your capacity in this area. Some child welfare workers, of course, find ways over time to use the experiences of the families with whom they work as a source of inspiration and hopefulness. So I think of this as sort of vicarious resilience. So it's newer language, I think, for those of us working in child welfare. I do think that getting to this point requires developing our practice and, sort of exercising that muscle that we have to use to see clearly all the ways that families rise above the challenges they experience and manage to live really decent and productive lives in spite of things, right? In spite of the hard things. So training ourselves to look for and identify the strengths in families improves not just our practice, but it also, makes it possible for us to keep working in the system and doing the work that we came here to do. So one of the things that you're going to hear me talking about repeatedly is this concept of resilience. And we talk a lot about resilience, promoting resilience within families, but we talk less, I think, in child protection about the application of the resilience concept to our own work and how to develop it in our own organizations. We know from our practice that having a future-oriented sort of solution-focused and hopeful approach is critical. So the shift away from what's wrong with our system to what is the vision that we're trying to create, what is the work that we really want to be doing with families. It's easier to achieve an articulated vision than it is to try to fix everything that's already gone wrong. That's true for families, it's true for us as well. So honestly asking ourselves sort of what is our capacity for improving how we practice, like introducing this universal education strategy, or reorienting ourselves toward creating a vision for what our work could look like, is a really important part of implementing this new safety card and doing it effectively. So I think that being able to implement this strategy requires that we work to both appreciate and embrace its value. So what does it add to us? What does it add to the families for the families that we serve? And what does it add to our own work and what we are trying to accomplish? So this whole first part of the webinar is both about context and helping you to see that value. For some of us, it's a big shift. For some organizations and for some individuals, it's a pretty significant shift. So having laid some of that groundwork, let's talk a little bit about domestic violence in child protection. So we hope that all child welfare agencies by this point have standards of practice for domestic violence cases that include what we've, this enormous body of knowledge that we've developed over 20 plus years of doing the work of sort of best practices around engagement and assessment and how to create plans with families that's actually going to make a difference for them and those kinds of things. What I would say to you, though, is if you work in a child welfare system that doesn't have those kind of practice standards, we could certainly provide you some examples from some other states to look at in an organizational effort so that you don't have to sort of start from ground zero. One of those best practices is moving ourselves away from thinking of, a series of physical assaults as being the indicator of domestic violence. So we know that domestic violence, and most child welfare agencies have definitions that incorporate all of the things that you see on this slide. So it's not just about physical assaults, it's also about all of these other things. So domestic violence as a pattern of behavior, right, it really requires that if we're going to get it right, if we're really going to truly understand what's going on within families, we have to have the ability to explore all of these different tactics and all of these different possibilities because they can all have an impact on children. They can all also significantly influence a mom's belief in her ability to improve her situation, her thinking about whether or not a safer and better life for herself and her kids and how possible it is to create that. We know that about 1 in 4 women in the U.S. report having experienced physical or sexual violence by a partner. So one of the reasons for a universal education strategy is because domestic violence is so very prevalent, and we know that providing women information is often the first step to them getting the help and the support that they need. The other thing that we know is that there are a lot of kids in this country who are being exposed to intimate partner violence every day. The data on this slide come from the National Survey of Children Exposed to Violence, which happened back in 2008. We know that about 1 in 15 kids are exposed to either physical or emotional or psychological intimate partner violence. We know that a lot of the kids who are exposed to intimate partner violence actually see the violence occurring. This is actually a much higher number than I used to believe was the case, so this was kind of a surprise. The last bullet, though, was not a surprise. It confirms what we know from earlier research, that we have, about a third of kids who witness physical intimate partner violence report being physically abused themselves. And the findings of this survey for kids' exposure to psychological abuse were similar. We also know a lot about the potential impact of exposure to intimate partner violence on kids, and we know that it has effects on, various domains of their functioning. So their emotional well-being, their cognitive capacity, their behavior, their interactions with peers, their relationships, their physical health, right? So all of those things are potential impacts. And so in child welfare, we tend to talk about these things within a framework of thinking about risk and protective factors. This isn't a conversation that's focused around risk and protective factors, so I'm not going to talk about everything on this slide, but I do want to draw your attention to a couple of things. One is the first bullet under protective factors. One of the things that we know is that the number one factor for how children weather their exposure to domestic violence is to have a consistent, caring relationship with at least one, hopefully more, safe adult in their life. So that to me, that is sort of a foundational concept to trying to reach more moms with a universal education strategy, because we know that when we help moms, we're helping their kids too. It's very often the parent who's not abusive who is this one caring and consistent relationship for this child, right? The other thing I just want to point your attention to is that we know in child welfare we work always on reducing risk factors, and we, I think, are moving in recent years toward more of an emphasis on building protective factors, because we know that resilience in kids can be supported through both of those strategies. So it's important to sort of pay attention to both of those things. You know, I think if we asked any group of adults, most of them would agree that exposure to intimate partner violence is not particularly healthy for kids, right? But I think if we ask 50 people, we might get 50 different opinions about how harmful it actually is. So one of the things that we know is that kids are differentially impacted as a result of some of the factors that you see on the slide in front of you. The other thing that might impact how those adults think about the level of harm that children experience as a result of exposure to violence, that's going to be informed by that adult's own experience of exposure to violence throughout their lives. It's also going to be affected by how they were raised and how they feel like they're doing as adults now, by how their own parents responded to challenges like, you know, poverty or lack of resources. It's informed by things like the norms of their community that they grew up in and they currently live in, whether those are geographical communities or cultural communities. So a lot of, you know, I think sort of a lot of general awareness that exposure to violence is not healthy for kids, and a lot of differences of opinion about exactly how kids are affected by it. I think that's true for moms as well. So here's, right, the question that we always get asked in child welfare, and I know that those of you who are DV folks on the webinar with us today would much prefer that we be asking a different question, which is, why are mothers battered so frequently, right? But it's a question that continues to be raised within child welfare, and so I do want to speak to it a little bit here. So if moms know on some level, most moms know on some level that exposure to violence of their kids is not the healthiest thing that their kids could be going through, right? So why do moms sometimes stay? So here's part of, I think, my response to this. Moms are constantly doing, in my experience, this sort of complicated calculus inside their heads. And sometimes it's a very conscious process, and sometimes it's an unconscious process, right? But the calculus is really about the risks and rewards of making a choice. So what would she and her kids be giving up in order to achieve perfect, consistent physical safety, or absolute no exposure to any future violence? So some of the factors that are in that calculation in her head are housing stability, educational stability for her children, friends and family and connections and neighborhoods and income, and, you know, her kids having a father and all of those things. So here's what I want us to keep thinking about within a child welfare context. I think that we too often have overly simplistic solutions, and I'm using air quotes around the word solutions, to domestic violence in child protection, right? They don't always match the reality of people's lives. So when we say, you know, go get a restraining order, go into shelter, leave your family, leave your community, flee, things like that, we're not actually dealing with all of those factors that moms have inside their heads that are also very specific to the well-being of their children. We know that educational stability for children is critically important. We know that continuity of relationships for children is critically important. And unfortunately, we sometimes still sort of go to these places of these formulaic solutions that don't actually work for moms or for their kids. The other thing I just want to say about this is that sometimes that calculation that moms are doing inside their head is about us, right? So it's the same kind of risk-reward kind of calculation. So what is it going to cost a mom and her children to be forthcoming with us about what's happening in her life? What is she risking to be the, you know, cooperative client that we really prefer to be working with? And the other thing about that, of course, is that if she begins to work with us in a cooperative way and she develops a plan and gets some help and, you know, we think things are going well, and then things start to fall apart in her life, as they so easily do, especially when people are sort of living on the edge of poverty, which a lot of our families are, right? So what if her child care falls through? What if she forgets to submit her paperwork to keep her food stamps coming in? So When people are living pretty close to the edge, it's easy for them to sort of fall over the edge, right? And moms know this. And so this, choice that we sort of force people to make about absolute physical safety over all of these other concerns that they have it's not legitimate, and it's not fair, and it's certainly not always the solution to what kids need, because as we started out our conversation talking about, kids need a whole lot more than just to not be exposed to violence. So the other thing I would say about this is that women's experiences of violence, both in the past and in the present, can increase risk to children in particular ways, right? It can result in depression, which can lead to sort of child neglect. It can lead to problematic parenting behaviors. These things are true. We know that when moms are helped to develop support networks and we help them to get their own needs met, the likelihood of those things diminishes, right? The other thing I just want to say about this is, speaking from my own experience as a person who's worked in child welfare for a long time now, I feel like when we first started talking about trauma, we used to throw this word around like traumatized moms, almost as though it was an indictment of them or that somehow they were damaged, right, as parents. And we almost found a way to blame them for things like their depression and their inability to focus and their inability to tolerate stress in a way that, someone else might. And our understanding of trauma has now evolved. We now recognize trauma as a common human experience. So we all experience trauma in our lives in different ways, right? So think about a time, for example, for any of you who are parents, the time when you lost your kid at the amusement park for 5 minutes. And your mind was a complete blank, and you couldn't think, and you couldn't figure out what to do next, and your palms were sweating, and your heart was racing. And all you could do was sort of, freeze in that moment. Same thing happens around something like a car accident or, so trauma exists in our lives in different ways. What I'd like you to think about is when you've had those experiences in your own life, I want you to think about the effect that it had on you for some time after that event. Because chances are it had an effect. And it might actually still be having an effect on you, right? So trauma-informed work is in part about us helping people to understand connections between people's past experiences with their current functioning, and that's what the safety card is about. So you've heard me say this before, but it bears repeating, right? The most consistent protective factor for kids exposed to domestic violence is the quality of their relationship with the non-offending parent, the non-abusive parent. So for us who work in child welfare, and our goal is really about promoting protective capacities to help kids to be safe and have their well-being assured in their own homes with their own families, then strengthening this mother-child bond is a key strategy for helping kids exposed to domestic violence. So this is the strategy. Help moms build resiliency. Help them build their own resiliency and help them build their children's resiliency. This slide is just an infographic that I really like that Futures produced, and you can certainly download it as a tool off their website. The thing that I like about it is that it captures a lot of research in a really understandable way. So it identifies sort of protective factors that promote resiliency in families, in children, and so forth, and it sort of breaks them up into an individual level factors, family level factors, and community factors. You'll see a lot of these things, you saw a lot of these things on our list of protective factors from a previous slide. For any of your child welfare agencies who are using the Center for the Study of Social Policy Strengthening Families approach, the 5 protective factors are embedded within this as well. So it's a really helpful tool, I think, that you can use in your organization to talk about some of these ideas about how do we grow our practice at promoting resiliency. And here's one of the things that we know about mothers and resiliency. We know that some moms who are hurt in relationships, who have experiences of violence, they get it, they sort of step up, they compensate for their children's exposure to violence by basically stepping up their own parenting. They increase their nurturing of children. They take active and repeated and ongoing steps to protect their kids and so forth. So some moms sort of do this. Some people have a little bit more innate capacity. Some people have better support systems. There are all kinds of reasons why some moms are able to do this. There are other moms who don't, for whom it's not so easy, right? So our job is really about planting some of these seeds, or at least part of our job is. So for those moms who don't recognize how trauma can affect their parenting, they don't necessarily have a process of reflecting on their own parenting choices and, you know, maybe some of their own overly harsh parenting strategies and sort of putting it into a context of the violence that's happening to them. You know, so some moms sort of need some help getting there. So increasing the mother's awareness about the effects of trauma can help them to make choices from a different place. And again, it's about sort of shifting away from thinking about what is wrong with this mom and instead thinking about what has happened to this mom and helping her to think about that too, so that she can move from a place of feeling as though she's some kind of a failure, right? And instead move to a place of feeling like she has active choices that she can make. So helping moms to see these connections opens a door for them. And it gives them an opportunity to reflect on some things that are really helpful as they go forward. So if we think that one of our tasks within child welfare is promoting resiliency and helping people to sort of have this kind of reflective process, I guess one of the things I'd like to do is to ask you all to tell us, how confident are you that you have the ability to directly and positively influence a mother's parenting or her view of herself as a parent? And you should be able to see the options in front of you on the screen. I'm just going to give you about a minute or so to register your responses. So it's looking like a lot of people on the webinar with us are somewhat confident, right? It depends. It sometimes depends on the person. It depends on the day. It depends on what else you have going on. It depends on your energy level that day and so forth. We also have some folks on the call who are extremely confident, experts at this. Maybe we can tap some of you to do future webinars. That would be lovely. And for some percentage of you, about 8-9% of you, it's not an area where you feel particularly confident. So those numbers might change a little bit as people continue to respond to the question, but I'm not terribly surprised at the spread of responses. And here's what I'd like to say to those of you who are in the somewhat confident or not confident categories, if you've sort of responded in that way. Here's what I want you to hear from me. You don't have to change everything that you do, right? This is not about learning some completely new thing. It's not about, making massive changes overnight. It's about small changes in our practice that every one of us can make, and we can start it immediately, right? So here are some of the things that make a difference. How we listen to people. Do we listen for understanding? Are we really listening to understand a person's sort of perspective on their own situation, or are we listening to prepare the next thing that we have to say? Those are two different things, right? How we demonstrate empathy rather than judgment. And sometimes that's simply a matter of asking a different kind of question, asking a question in a different context, asking a question at a different time with different pacing, right? So there are ways that we can sort of change how we interact with people that's simply about changing how we ask questions. Certainly, it makes a difference how we provide information. And I'm excited that we're finally going to be getting here to the card, because this is a new way of presenting information. And there's no perfection expected or required as you begin to think about using this card, right? It's really about, it's a It's a tool for us. It's a conversation starter. It's an opener of an ongoing process. So the other things that, of course, make a difference are that, when we can help people to sort of see their own strengths, when we are, rather than trying to convince people that we see strengths in them, which is what I see happening, a lot of child protection workers doing, let me convince you of all the things that I see that are going well in your parenting, not as helpful as when you can draw it out of a person by the kinds of questions that you're asking. So we're going to be talking about some of those things. And we're now at the point where we're actually going to talk about the card. So thanks for bearing with me up to this point. So this is really about improving a child welfare response by introducing a universal education tool with mothers about connections between trauma and domestic violence, childhood trauma and domestic violence, and current parenting choices, and so forth. So it assumes that any mom that you're interacting with may have had trauma during their childhood or has experienced domestic violence. So it's not a card that we only offer when we know that moms have been experiencing domestic violence or we suspect that they are, victims of domestic violence. This is for all moms. So it is truly a universal education approach, and it assumes that when we offer people information, they're going to benefit from that information and having this tool available to them. So talking with all moms sort of normalizes the conversation. Talking to them about how their early experiences are connected to what's happening today makes it easier for them to talk to us about those things, right? So it becomes part of that ongoing dialogue. And in the process, if we're thoughtful, we can become much better versed in helping moms to think about and create a vision for what they want for themselves and for their kids in the future. We have some cautions, obviously, because we're talking about at least the potential for intimate partner violence. And that is that we don't provide this kind of an educational tool in front of a partner, in front of a family member or a friend, at least not initially, because we don't know what roles those people have with the person who may be on the receiving end of the violence, if there is violence occurring. We don't use family members to interpret because we know the possibilities for danger within that kind of a practice approach. We also don't leave information lying around or in a packet of materials without checking in to make sure that it's safe to do so, right? So I just want to say a couple of things. About the piece that's about trying to get private access to mom is not always an easy thing within child welfare, but I've seen child welfare workers meet moms in a lot of different places. They offer to give her a ride to the grocery store, and so that she doesn't have to take the bus, and there's an opportunity for a conversation. Or they meet a mom at a therapy appointment, or they make arrangements to talk to her at the school pickup or drop off or things like that. So we do sometimes have to get a little bit creative about how we connect with moms, and we'll continue to have to do that. We don't do universal education when people are in crisis. Obviously, we're not going to try to pull out our card and talk to people when we're in the middle of removing children from our care or things like that. We also wouldn't be using a card or a strategy like this when a mom is high or drunk or things like that. So, we're going to use, obviously, our common sense about when to use this strategy, when to pull out this card to open this conversation up. And it's helpful to think of it as, I think, it's a bridge. It's sort of a tool that people can use to reflect and to try to understand and to find help and to feel strong. So the conditions in which you're offering it sort of have to be conducive to hearing that, that message of hope for a different kind of future. So here's the first panel of the card. We are there. So let me just give you a little bit of an orientation to the card, and then we're going to walk through each panel. So the information on the left of each of these slides is not on the card. These are sort of prompts for us to think about, in this webinar. So this, you might be the first person to help, is not part of the card. The card itself is what's in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. The other thing is this card is designed as sort of an accordion card. It folds up to about the size of a business card, so it's folded into sections, and so these panels may show up in slightly different orders when that card is folded up. Again, this card is designed to be provided to all moms, not just moms when domestic violence is part of a report, and not only when domestic violence is suspected, right? So it can be offered as part of a first visit. If you've been working with a mom for a while and you're interested in trying to build this use of this card into your practice, you can, introduce it as, I just found this great new resource and I want to share it with you, and, see if it opens up a new line of conversation with you or things like that. So it's really a part of developing a relationship or deepening a relationship and having an ongoing conversation with people. This next panel of the card, the message of it is, and I'm going to talk about some specific things on it, but the overall message of this part of the card, this panel, is that we care about you and your children, right? So we want you to believe in yourself. So if you think about the language on this panel, we give this card to every mom or female caregiver, right? So you're not being singled out. There's lots of moms who need help to be the best mother they can be, right? The next piece of it, whatever your story, whatever is happening with your child, you deserve support and help too. So we don't think you're a failure. We think you're a human being who deserves help and support, even if bad things have happened to your children, right? Our deepest hope is for safety. The most important factor in children's healing from hard things is a strong and safe relationship with their mom. This card looks at bigger picture things that might be affecting you, because studies show us that when we invest in moms, we help kids. So we know the message here, right? We know that by helping you to feel and be strong, your children are going to benefit. This next piece of it, as a parent, you also have rights, and sharing what is happening to you might affect your case. Ask your worker or lawyer for more information on your rights and what can and can't be confidential. So this caution, I think, is really important. It may also be, I think, one of the bigger sticking points or the bigger challenges for child protection staff, because we are always in this position of feeling like we have to know every single thing, even when we're pretty clear inside our own heads that we don't always have good solutions for everything. But organizationally, it can feel like there's a lot of pressure for you to sort of know everything and know it as fast as possible. So I recognize that. And organizationally, this could be a little bit of a struggle. But I'd like you to think about it in this way. Our job, if we really think that our job is about facilitating a change process so that kids can be safe and their well-being can be assured, then we have to recognize that we have to sort of do that one step at a time. And this card, this strategy, is one step in getting there. It's not the whole process. It's, as I said, a conversation starter. It's an opener. So sometimes in child welfare, some of you may have heard this phrase before, we have to go slow to go fast, right? We have to have patience. We have to invest in relationships. And we have to recognize that our understanding of a family situation is going to evolve and deepen over time. So there's nothing about this card, I don't think, that's contrary to sort of those realities of child welfare. And in fact, I think it's an enormously important complement to what we do. So as we're talking about this next panel, I would love you to think about what difference it might make to say these kinds of things to a mom and to say them with compassion, right? So if you got this card today, you may feel helpless. So it's acknowledging emotions that people feel when they're involved with the child welfare system, when their kids have been hurt, right? Maybe your child was hurt, put in danger, or their needs weren't met. So we all mess things up as parents at times, and our children can suffer as a result of that. The next line, we can't change the past, but we can change the future, right? So the other part of that message is, but we can move forward in healthier ways. So let's do it now. Let's take the first step. Let me give you this card. Maybe you'll take some time to read it. You'll absorb some information. Maybe it will be a bit of a reflection for you, right? There's no service referral needed for this. This is about asking people to take one small step by accepting and reading the card and reflecting on some of the information and the questions that are posed on the card. That all by itself is a step in a good direction. And so the title of this slide, Powerful Women, even that one step can be sort of a step toward more empowerment. And I can't sort of overemphasize the importance of these very small steps for moms when they've had these kinds of experiences. So the last piece of this, we know that some moms aren't fully understood. A lot of us, you know, we may not understand everything that you've been going through, but the message here is that we want to understand and we want to help you feel empowered. We know that helping you feel empowered is not going to be helpful just for you, but it's going to be enormously helpful for your children as well. The next panel, right, here's what I want you to be thinking about as we're talking about this panel. You may be the first person to ever give someone information about domestic violence. And that is a very, very powerful position to be in. And you're doing it the way that the panel of the card is framed is ask yourself, right? So it's an invitation to reflection. How does your relationship affect you? How does it affect your parenting? How does it affect your children and their safety? So it's an invitation to reflection. The other thing I really love about this panel is this title, right, On Bad Days, because there's an assumption built into that it's bad days, it's not all days, it's not your whole life isn't crap, right? We all have bad days, which means we all have good days too, and it's important that we think about, you know, the things that happen on bad days because there's something there for us to learn. The other thing that I like about it, and I just want to draw your attention to, again, sort of not just on this panel, but we are using sort of simple language. There's only a few pieces of information on each panel. I just want to remind you that we are planting seeds. So you may be the first person as well to help a mom to understand that her substance abuse, for example, might be the way that she learned to cope, or that her depression is a result of early childhood trauma. So this panel that is titled Making Connections is about helping moms to see those connections. So it's about saying to someone what happened to you can affect your life now. So those traumatic events, whether they happened to you in the past or whether they're happening to you right now, can have an effect on your life in this moment. There's, this panel has sort of an informational aspect to it, right? So it's not just, so we're helping people to sort of make connections about sort of risk factors. So risks within your relationship, risks to your parenting, right? But also risks to your physical and mental health. So this sort of speaks to moms as whole people, which is an enormously important part of the message, I think, of this card. The other thing I just want to say is this piece about substance use. You know, any of you who work in child welfare agencies that are actively using and promoting solution-focused practice, you know, in Sue Kim Berg's frame for things like substance abuse, right, or other kinds of things that families sometimes do, is that they're unsuccessful attempts to solve problems. And I like that frame because, to me, it's helpful to remind ourselves that we don't need to be judging people for some of these behaviors, that our job is to sort of make them visible and to put people in a place where they feel like they can make different choices, you know, going forward into the future. So this last piece of it, it's not the end of the story, right? Your story isn't done being written. You can create a different kind of ending for your story. You can create a better future for your children. So there's a real message of hope within that. This slide is not on the card, but I just love this quote from Carol Warshaw at the National Center on DV Trauma and Mental Health, right? So I decided to throw it in anyway, even though it's not part of the card. But at its heart, sort of trauma-informed practice is about creating environments and relationships that offer an atmosphere of safety, connection, and hope. And to me, that's what this card is sort of fundamentally about. So the next panel of the card is, you know, sort of addressing the worries that moms may have about kids, or providing information if moms don't sort of understand that, you know, that some of the things that their kids are going through should be worrying. So this is about helping moms to understand impact. So we know you love your kids, right? So we expect that some of you probably are already worried about your kids. If you're seeing some of these things, you know, you may have made the connection between things that have happened to them and what you're seeing in their behavior and so forth. If you haven't thought about those things before, here's some information for you to consider. Maybe you can see your children's behaviors or how they're functioning sort of in a different light. So again, it's about offering information to help moms see connections they might not previously, have considered or seen. So next steps, the parts about sort of what can you do going forward, right? So you can take better care of yourself. You can connect with other people. Sometimes you might want to do that anonymously, right? And here are some places to do things like that. Learn how to get control of difficult emotions, right? So all of that sort of embedded within this panel. So the first bullet here, which is actually a check mark, the Tactical Breather Trainer, it's a free cell phone app that helps people to learn how to do deep breathing. One of the things that we know is that trauma can make it difficult for people to think clearly, to focus, to take in information, right? So deep breathing not only helps people to calm themselves down when they're agitated, but it also increases brain activity in areas associated with attention, focus, and decision-making. So getting someone to begin sort of a deep breathing practice all by itself can actually improve parenting choices that people are making. The other message I think of this panel is that making really small changes like eating better, right, getting enough sleep, they can help moms feel like, oh, I could do that, right? I could do that one step to take better care of myself, which makes them feel more capable of making additional changes. So big changes don't happen overnight. More often than not, it's a series of small changes. And that's one of the messages, I think, of this panel that's so important. And similarly, even small things that you do differently with your kids can make an enormous difference for your children. So you don't have to be a super mom. You can help your children, talk about their feelings. You can help them develop mastery in some area so that they feel successful, right? So some of those things, their first three things are sort of those kinds of suggestions. The fourth bullet, which is about getting outside support, I think is a message that, sometimes kids need more than we can provide as parents. So support might mean, talking to a school counselor or a relative, a grandmother, an aunt, an uncle, might be going to a therapist. So it sort of frames support broadly. And finally, we always want to be planting a seed about having moms really think about safety with their kids and involving their kids in active safety planning whenever possible, because we know that it helps to empower kids and it's helpful when they know what they should and shouldn't be doing. So these pieces, these small steps, it's really about this concept, right? So when you can encourage people to begin to take small steps that develop their resiliency, it increases their self-efficacy. So even on a day when moms have, had a really bad day, things have happened, maybe they haven't sort of made their best parenting choices, maybe violence has occurred, any number of things might cause it to be a bad day. Maybe they've relapsed on a substance abuse, problem. And one of the things that we know is that when people can, say at the end of a bad day, sit down and read a book to their child at night or talk to their child about how their day went in school, that, even sort of being able to make those small choices when previous choices throughout the day maybe haven't been the healthiest, can, when we can illustrate those, when we can highlight those, when we can make those things visible, we can help parents to understand that everything that they're doing is actually a choice and that they can make good choices even on those bad days. So these next couple of things are really about getting support for yourself, and you'll see that it's not just about support for, intimate partner violence. It's support for it might be that kind of support. So the National DV Hotline is sort of listed as a resource. There's also the Child Helpline if you're struggling with managing your feelings as a parent. There's a treatment referral line if you're struggling with sort of mental health, alcohol, or substance abuse needs. So, and then the final panel is, some of those numbers and the Futures logo and so forth, and a reiteration of every parent needing support. So I think it's that sort of, we're at the end of the card itself, but I hope I've been able to convey to you what I think each of these really well-designed panels is about, and the energy that we hope that it provides to the kinds of conversations that we want to be having with moms, all moms. Because universal education is a complement to direct screening, right? And the lovely thing about universal education is it doesn't require disclosure for her to get help and to think about accessing some support and some resources for herself. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't like her to be talking to us about these things in child welfare, and in fact, we may need to ask direct questions about that, and we will. But, you know, this is an opportunity to give mom some information and some windows into some help for herself that even before she's ready to begin talking to us. So steps to using the card. The first, you know, I realize we have two number ones here. It should be number 1 and number 2. Sorry about that. Normalize the activity, right? So I've started giving these cards to all moms because we know that there's always stuff that can get in the way of moms being the best moms they want to be, right? Then making the connection. So we know that you deserve support just as your children deserve support. And a lot of times we tend to forget that moms need support too. So, you know, that's an important part of the messaging of this. So we're not suggesting that in using this card that you do the 20-minute or however long it just took me to do that review of each panel and the explanation of it, because that's not what this is about. This is a brief intervention. That was for our learning purposes, but this is sort of intended as, you know, you sort of open the card, you do a quick review. So let me just tell you what's here, right? The card talks about everything from parenting strategies to ways that being hurt by a partner or hurt during your childhood can affect your health and your parenting, right? Maybe then you add in a piece of information. In about a half or maybe a third of my caseloads, moms are being hurt by partners, and we know if we can help support moms, it's one of the best ways to support her child. So again, not intended as the kind of process that we just walked through, but more, let me just give you a quick orientation to the card. The other thing that you can say within this process is, you know, you can say if it doesn't apply to you, you could give it to somebody else to whom it might, who might actually benefit from it. So this pay it forward idea, the lovely thing about having a small card that can be handed off to somebody else is that they could offer it to somebody else that they know. The interesting thing is that one of the things that we know from research about, or we know from parent forums, I should say, some of the Strengthening Families, you know, parent forums, parent cafes, I think they're called, is that when parents feel like they have something to offer, it makes it a little bit easier for them to ask for help from someone else. So this is one of those little pieces that, you know, it's chock full of good information, and if they can offer it to somebody who needs it, it might also, you know, change them a little bit and make it a little bit easier for them to ask for some help that they need. And then the last piece of it is about sort of the warm referrals. So you sort of walk people through the resources. You talk to them about the fact that the DV hotline and the child helpline are both anonymous. They don't even need to know your real name. You know, so if people aren't ready to go there, they can call and they can get some anonymous support and some help from some non-judgmental people, right? So for some people, that's going to be a real draw, that they can call those people, and it doesn't have to be sort of exposing themselves fully, right? So that might be a little bit too vulnerable a position for somebody who's just starting out. And within child welfare, you know, of course, you might consider following up with a direct question. So are any of these things that you need help with today, or things that you would like to talk more about? So that's sort of how we envision the card being used. And I'd like to just ask you to, if you would, tell us your thoughts in the chat box, because this card is new to us, and we're going to be looking for some places to pilot its use. And it would be really helpful to us if you could tell us what you would need to be able to begin using this kind of approach in your work. So what would you need from yourself internally? What would you need from your supervisor or manager? What would you need from your organization? What would you need from your partners, right? So I'm also noticing just a couple of things, a couple of questions in the chat box that people are asking about, would you leave the card with the mom? And while you are entering your response to this question that's on this slide. Let me just respond to that since I happen to notice it. So we wouldn't, I think we sort of covered this in an earlier slide. You really need to ask permission to leave a card like this with a mom. So even having this kind of information could actually present a level of, an element of sort of risk to her. So you would certainly need to find out whether or not it would be safe to leave the card. Somebody recommended a strategy of taping your business card over the resource panel, so that it looks like something in your walls. It's just the business card from your child welfare worker. So I do think that's a really important part of paying attention to. So if we know that violence might be part of somebody's experience, then we have to make sure that we're not, sort of leaving materials around that are going to clue a partner into the fact that we've been talking to someone about this, if that makes sense. So as you're telling us your thoughts in the chat box, I'm going to keep talking a little bit. We're going to capture all of these. We're going to have access to all of this information, and we're going to use your ideas about what you would need to be able to begin using the card as we sort of develop implementation strategies and, suggestions for the jurisdictions who might be interested in piloting it. So thank you all for those ideas and those suggestions. And I'm going to just keep talking for a minute about what we do in child protection, right? If somebody says to us, yes, this is actually happening to me, or if we know that domestic violence, is sort of part of the report that we've received. So universal education is sort of a complement to what we do. And sometimes we know about domestic violence before we ever get out to the home. And sometimes, somebody opening up this conversation actually leads us into a very quick conversation with somebody, a very rapid conversation about, current experiences of violence. That's always going to be the case within child welfare. So while this is not a webinar, and we certainly don't have time to cover, best practice soup to nuts or anything like that, there are some basic things that I just want to say in the last, 5 or 10 minutes of what I want to present to you. So, one of the first things that we can do when a mom discloses domestic violence is to, remember that we're a person too, and to act like a person and not like, we're just some kind of a professional that has a role to play. So I do think that being genuine and being authentic is the right tone to take. It's the right place to start. And making sure that we are staying in a conversation and that we're listening so that we avoid jumping into our professional assessment mode. I'm not suggesting that assessment doesn't need to happen. Of course it does. It doesn't need to be, sort of the role that we take on the minute that somebody starts to talk to us about violence that's going on in her life. And I think the vast majority of child welfare workers are very skilled at staying in a conversation, right? The conversation is really about seeking understanding of her perspective and her worries for her kids. It's about engaging her in that conversation about what she might have to give up in order to achieve physical safety, so that risk and rewards conversation, because that's an individual thing for every person. We can ask questions that help us and her to find her resilience and her problem-solving skills. We're always wanting to know, does she have people around her who support her, right? Do her children love her partner dearly? What does that mean for how we're going to move forward, right? So those kinds of things. And always this reminder that we want to engage people in a safety planning process. And sometimes we have to do it a little bit hypothetically if we don't actually have a disclosure, but we know that we have indications that violence might be occurring. So I know you're saying that it's not going to go badly this weekend when he comes to visit the kids, but should that actually happen, let's just talk about what you might do, right? So you can do sort of hypothetical safety planning if you don't have a disclosure. The other thing is, if our job is really about sort of making her resilience visible, so we ask questions like these, right? Who are your people? Who's helped you? How did they help you? We know that social connections are a critically important part of safety for moms and kids, right? So, and who are your kids? Who are your kids? Who would they say their people are, right? What have you tried before, and what else have you thought about trying to keep yourself and your kids safe? This final bullet, and let me just say, these are not exhaustive lists of questions. I hope I've made that clear, but they're helpful kinds of questions to ask when you're in this conversation, right? So a kind of a question that's like, with everything that's going on, right, I understand that you're feeling really depressed and that you're having difficulty getting out of bed in the morning. So how do you manage to get your kids to school every day? Because that is a question that helps somebody to articulate where they find the strength in themselves to make things as normal as possible for their kids. That's a critically important piece of information. And it's an illustration of, resilience. So that's one of those, like for any of you who are using solution-focused kinds of questions, that's one of those coping questions, right? Here are some other helpful things to say. So in what ways does drinking or drugs, in what ways does it make your life harder? So again, you're sort of asking someone to engage in a process of reflecting on these things with you. More language here about safety planning and how to say that to somebody in one of these conversations. It can help kids to feel less scared, and it's important that they know what they should do and also what they should not do. They should not jump in between the two of you to try to keep you safe, right? Finally, one of the things that we always suggest that people do within child welfare is to ask, how do you think your partner is going to respond to us being involved? Because we know that us being involved can actually increase danger or risk to you if we're not careful about that. So here are a couple of more ways to help moms see their own strength and imagine maybe a better future for themselves. So tell me about a time when you felt stronger or when you were able to stay clean and sober, right? What do you feel proudest of as a parent? How could we help you feel more of those proud moments? 5 years from now, if someone asks your kids to describe you as their mom, what do you hope they would say, and how can we help you get there? So those all have sort of an orientation of finding moments of resilience, even within really difficult circumstances, and or projecting, a different kind of vision for the future. So I don't think I really need to cover this slide, but I didn't feel like I could leave it out. We felt like, for the purpose of an archived version of this, that we needed to have a slide in about safety planning, some additional language about sort of being in that process. And so here we are returning to what I said to you at the beginning of this, which is it is really, really important and helpful to know who your partners are on a personal level or professional level at the DV programs that you are working with collaboratively. And if you don't know who those people are, find a way to go and introduce yourself or find a way to invite them to come to you. Because making a warm referral, right, as opposed to, here's their hotline number, why don't you give them a call sometime? Instead, if you're able to, at the moment when somebody's willing to talk to you about their experience, you say, let me pick up the phone and call Laura over at the program, right? She's an expert in safety planning, and she can help you really think through your options. And we can make that happen right now if you're willing to do that with me in the next 5 minutes. That kind of a referral is going to make an enormous difference for a mom. So it's more than handing out phone numbers, right? Supported referral makes a real difference in how people are able to use that resource. So the other thing, of course, is that DV agencies and advocates do so much more than provide shelter. They obviously do training and so forth in the community. They have, in addition, sort of all kinds of information about how to access other things that mothers need. Housing services, legal advocacy, kids programs, and so forth. So if you don't have an active and ongoing collaboration with your DV agencies, you're really working with sort of one hand tied behind your back. And I think it would be really smart to untie that hand and develop these relationships. It's going to help your families, and it's going to help you as well. And one of the things that we've learned from home visitation research, and I will tell you that I recently myself, as part of a procurement process here, I live in Massachusetts, and I've been part of the procurement of domestic violence services. So we recently conducted focus groups and surveys that told us this same lesson that you're seeing on the slide in front of you, which is there are far too many women who don't know what's available to them. They don't know about local resources. They don't know that there's a national hotline. And the only people that they feel like they can talk to are people who are friends or family, but not always. So, I just want to remind us there's no bad, there's no downside to learning more about the resources that are available and helping people to understand how to access those resources. It's all upside. It's all helpful, not just to moms, but to their children as well. And, I think is an important message for us. We don't have to be experts in order to play a really important role in this. I see we have a little weird thing happening on the screen in terms of where our support sort of got divided, so sorry about the little weirdness in that on the slide. But the point is the same, right? You are in a unique opportunity to provide education, to provide this very brief intervention that can make an enormous difference in the lives of the families that we serve. So I wouldn't feel comfortable as a child protection person without giving you a couple of other things that we sort of build into all of our trainings about how to do domestic violence work in child protection, right? One is that before you leave this conversation, you need to say something along these lines. I'm going to need to talk to your partner because that's pretty much always true within child welfare. I'm going to need to talk to your partner, but I don't need to tell them everything that you or the kids have said, right? So we're avoiding, because we have a sort of a do no harm standard, we're avoiding using disclosures of moms and kids, and we're looking for third-party sources of information in order to structure those conversations with the partner who's used violence or abuse. I'll tell you when we're meeting. I'm going to check in with you after the meeting. Can you help me to think about how I could have that conversation without increasing danger or risk to you or your kids? So really an important piece of what we need to build into our practice. A scaling question, which is sort of the second bullet here, is really about assessing, do you have what you need to make your safety plan work? And scaling questions are something that we use all the time in child welfare, right? So if 1 is, there's no way I can do this, and 10 is, I have everything that I need to make this plan work, where are you right now as I'm getting ready to walk out the door? And what else could I do or could you do that would help you move up your, your confidence level, your certainty and your ability to use the safety plan by 1 number. So not what's going to get you to a 10, but if you started at a 5, how could we help you get to a 6? Again, it's about incremental change and incremental growth, right? And finally, how are we going to talk again privately soon? And would you like someone else to be there with us in that conversation to support you? So I didn't feel like I could sort of leave this without making those last couple of points. So now I just want to circle back around, and I'm sure that some of these things are things that you put into the chat box. I would be amazed if they're not on the list of things that you need in order to implement this kind of a strategy. But I just want to mention a couple of things by way of wrapping up. 1 is good supervision is absolutely essential. So the kind of supervision that allows us to step back, to learn from our mistakes, to learn from the choices that we made that we wish that we had made a little differently, that uses a strengths-based approach that helps to illustrate our own excellent practices instead of only focusing on the things that we have done wrong. That kind of supervision is critically important to being able to implement this kind of a strategy effectively. And I think that if you don't have this kind of supervision, it's certainly within your power to ask for sort of a recontracting process with your supervisor to tell them sort of more what kind of supervision would be more helpful to you. The other thing is I do want to, again, sort of circle back to this deep breathing thing, because it's not only a tool for families, it's also a tool for us and for the same reason. So mindful breathing actually helps us to make better decisions by increasing this brain activity in those areas associated with attention and focus and decision making. So always helpful for us. We have a lot of direct trauma in our own work, a difficult removal, right? We have to go to court and defend a position that we may not fully believe in, but that was sort of, told to us as sort of we needed to remove children or things like that. So any of those moments when we can sort of do that deep breathing kind of practice, it can help us to move forward in ways where we feel more resilient, where we feel more able to, take the next step in a positive way. The other thing is, I just want to emphasize to you that you can do work with your coworkers about developing resiliency, even without an entire organizational framework that's about building a resilient organization. So you can take some of this responsibility on yourselves with your coworkers, and here's one simple strategy to do that. Make sure that you're highlighting good things, whether this is one-on-one or you're doing it in a unit meeting or so forth. And I decided to wrap up with these couple of slides because I can't emphasize enough that the context in which you are trying to implement a new practice approach, like using the safety card, is going to have everything to do with your ability to sort of sustain that practice. I'm going to invite Leanna to come back on the line with us, and we're going to do some questions and answers here for the next few minutes. But the other thing that we're going to be doing as we're responding to questions is offering you some of these resources on the next several slides. So I mentioned to you at the beginning of this presentation that we had some resources available to you for thinking about sort of organizational resilience and how you take care of yourselves and all of those things. A lot of those things are on this slide. There are some other really helpful resources on this slide as well. And we'll continue to move forward through, the national hotline slides and the culturally specific organizations, DD organization slides and so forth as we're taking questions. So, Leanna, are you back with us?
Sure. Yes, I am. Thanks, Shelley. That was wonderful. Really concrete, deep information. So thank you for that. I just want to say, I know there's been a little bit of flurry in the chat about wanting the cards now, and I'm so excited that people are liking the cards and want them. So this is a soft launch, and so what we're trying to do is sort of gauge the kind of resources, tools, and training that folks need to be able to implement these cards. So we are looking for communities to sort of partner with and pilot the card with them. So we would want to partner with you. So I'm not going to just send you a bunch of cards and have you go. I think, as Shelley pointed out, there's sort of a lot of safety and sort of practice considerations to think about in implementing these cards. So I kept putting the team email into the chat, but if folks are interested in these cards, right now they are available. We have them in English, and we're putting the final touches on the Spanish. And yes, we are also going to be working on sort of a gender-neutral card. Please do email us at childrensteam@futureswithoutviolence.org. And as Shelley said, I have some slides here. So the slide previous to this were a lot of great resources if you wanted to go more in depth about some of the things that Shelley talked about, some of the mindfulness, the trauma stewardship website is amazing. Also really highly recommend, if you're not hooked up with the ACEs Connection group, it's a robust community of practitioners from all kinds of sectors and the sort of general public really coming together to share information, conversations, and resources on ACEs, trauma-informed practice, and it's a wonderfully great resource if you haven't checked it out. So you'll have all these in your PowerPoint. And just a reminder, here are the hotlines. We also have links here to the national resource centers that are culturally specific or issue specific, like Futures here has the National Health Resource Center. All of these agencies provide primarily free resources as well as TA and training, so please check out their websites. Let's see. These are the culturally specific ones. Oh, sorry, Shelley, you and I are both clicking on the thing. Yeah, so I think the only other thing that I'll add here before we jump into some of the great questions is that we are looking to develop, in-person training curriculum as well as potentially a train-the-trainer model in the future for the usage of this card, so that it doesn't rely on Futures folks going out, and that we can get a much wider distribution. So all of those things are ideas for the future, and will be contingent on funding and such. So let's move to one of the questions that we didn't get to. Okay, so here's a pretty concrete one, Shelley. We have domestic violence liaisons working with child services. Would the DCPP worker use this in their conversations or the DVLs? I'm assuming that's domestic violence liaisons, right?
Yeah, and I'm guessing this is New Jersey because that's the language that they use. So, hi, New Jersey folks. Yeah, I mean, I think that we're talking about both, right? So, again, I feel like it's a universal education card, and I think that there's value in child welfare workers learning how to make this a part of their practice repertoire. And, you know, the referrals that come to you as domestic violence liaisons, I think, you know, it's certainly there's a very probably an easy use for you in terms of helping moms to really see these connections between experiences they've had in their lives with current parenting choices. Because again, I feel like the overarching goal is to try to make some of those connections really visible for moms so that they can understand that they have choices about how they sort of use that information and what they can learn from understanding those connections and how they apply that in making parenting choices going forward, and also how they make choices about their own personal safety. So I actually think that either the DVLs or the DPCC, I think I'm getting the language right, workers could use it equally well. I think it might be a little bit of a harder lift for child welfare workers to learn how to use it, but not, you know, but I think it's doable, and I think they should. I think it's we're trying to reach as many people as possible, right?
Absolutely. Great. Let's move on to another question. So this is from Luann, and she wrote, I'm thrilled to see this. I'm working as a private attorney and deal with high-conflict CPS-involved cases. I will use this card immediately, but want suggestions on how to help bring all of the providers together and assist attorneys and judges in understanding the complexity of sexual coercion and coercive control. Ooh, that's a meaty one.
I was going to say.
Can you define collaboration for us? Yeah.
Well, it is a very valid question, and certainly beyond the scope of, you know, a 3-minute response. So,
yeah.
You know, I don't really have a short answer for that other than to say that I think that, you know, one possibility related to this card to start a conversation would be to say to some of those colleagues and peers, right, look at this great resource. Here's why I'm starting to use it. What do you think? You know, so I don't mean to say that that's sort of the full response to that. I do think that when you're having difficulty establishing sort of a collaborative approach to a problem like this that has so many different facets and so many different things to pay attention to, that there's all kinds of things that are needed to make that happen, starting with finding some key leaders who can take some responsibility and pull a group together that have to do with things like making sure that people understand the value of having a collaborative approach to their own work as well as to the families on whose backs we are all earning our paychecks, let's face it. You know, so there's a lot of things that sort of go into that we learned through the Green Book Project, that we've learned by trying to do this work, you know, well and effectively for a number of years. So, so I don't have sort of a full answer to that in the time that we have left. I guess what I would say is I think both the council and Futures have a ton of experience in this area. And if you're really looking to get something started, I would make a request for some assistance in this area and you know, make sure that we have plenty of time to sort of talk that through with you rather than trying to address, as you say, such a meaty topic in the last 5 minutes of the webinar. It's a perfectly legitimate question, though, and I certainly understand that is the context in which this card is going to be effective, right?
Right, absolutely. I mean, I would totally agree, and I do think that the Resource Center from the National Council would be an excellent place to initiate a TA request, Luann, if you would like to do that. And maybe Patricia could put the email or the phone number for the Resource Center into the chat for you, just so we have it. Let's see, are there, so, I'm curious, for the folks who are still with us, we have about 5 minutes. I heard a lot of positive feedback on the card, and we so appreciate that and feel validated. But if you did read something on there, we are trying to figure out how to make this work and to really produce the best real-world tools that folks can use to help families. So if something struck you as odd or you had some critical feedback, we are also open to those suggestions as well. And if you wanted to send us a more full response about what you think it would take to get this kind of universal education strategy into your community, I would love to engage in a phone conversation or a longer email. That would also be really helpful for us as we move forward with this project. And one thing I failed to mention at the beginning, which I meant to, was that this is, the child welfare card that we've developed. I think Shelley mentioned this, but we've got a number of other cards. We've got one for teen moms in home visitation. We've got a general home visitation card. We've got cards for college campuses addressing sexual assault. We've got cards for the LGBT community and the trans community, a lot of different settings and populations addressing a number of issues, and we've had enormous success implementing them. Some of them have been formally and rigorously evaluated. So I would encourage you to check out the Futures website for more information about those additional safety cards in addition to the child welfare one. So I don't see any other questions, I think. Shelley, is there anything else that you want to add in here before we sort of thank folks and wrap up?
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I guess the only thing that I would like to say is, I recognize that all of you have a million things that you could be doing, and maybe you've been doing some of them while you've been on the webinar. So I guess what I just want to say is, I'm constantly moved by the number of people who care so much about families that they take the time to keep learning and keep deepening their awareness and continue to struggle over hard questions and use the new tools that are available to us and continue to sort of evolve this work. So one of the things, and I said this to folks in New Jersey when I was there recently, like as I get older, I'm just so very grateful for the fact that there are so many people in this effort, and it feels like sort of a movement. And I just want to thank all of you for participating with us today, because I think you're part of that. So thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Shelley. I echo the gratitude here, and just really want to throw out some more appreciation for the National Council for partnering with us on this webinar, and also to Rebecca Levinson, who is one of the primary developers of the card, in addition to all those out there who have already provided input on the development of the card, and especially to Shelley, who was our wonderful presenter today and also really integral in developing the card. So thank you for all of you who've joined us. Please reach out to us with more questions or requests for information. We'd happily stay engaged with you all, and I hope you have